Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Heavyweights of the Faith, brief biographies of great believers who changed the world.
Without Thomas A. Dorsey, who was born in Villa Roca, Georgia on July 1, 1899, there would be no Yolanda Adams, Donnie McClurkin, Whitney Houston, or Kurt Franklin. Thomas Dorsey was a man who found himself conflicted between the work of man and the work of God. God did use Tom Dorsey, and by obeying the voice of God and utilizing his gifts, Tom A. Dorsey revolutionized the sacred church music and ushered in a new genre, gospel. Dorsey's father was an itinerant preacher, and his mother was a church organist. Together, they would produce what would later become known as the father of gospel music. Thomas A. Dorsey attained his education from a rural classroom in Villa Roca, Georgia. As the child of a preacher, Thomas attended elementary school where he would learn academics and observe the benefits associated with being the child of a preacher. People all around made much of Thomas because he was the preacher's son. Watching his father preach was another lesson for a growing Thomas. As all good preachers of his time, his father had a flair for the dramatic in his preaching. The use of call and response, where the preacher would make a statement and the congregation responds. The respect his father received from the congregants was not lost on Thomas. In the gritty rooms of performance halls, Thomas received some of the most valued lessons. By the age of 8, he learned how to play the organ from his mother, but he learned the syncopations of blues and jazz when he visited the nightclubs of Atlanta, where musicians taught him their techniques for playing the piano. To further his musical career, Tom Dorsey would eventually leave Atlanta and move to Chicago, a hotbed of jazz and blues music. There, he learned to master piano playing. His love for music would take him outside the church, into the jazz and blues halls of Chicago. His childhood Christian teachings conflicted with his striving in the secular world, where he made a living for himself playing at rent parties and composing blues songs. His mother often advised him to stop playing secular music and serve the Lord. He ignored her pleas, and at 21 years old, he found himself playing for Ma Rainey, a noted blues performer. His talents also led him into a position as an arranger for the Chicago Music Publishing Incorporated and Vocalion Records. God had been calling Dorsey to the world of sacred music, and much like Jonah, Dorsey would resist the call. As a result, like Jonah, he too would be swallowed up. Dorsey was in Chicago in 1920, at the time when blues music was peaking. Dorsey's skills were in high demand at the nightclub. During the day, he continued to work other jobs and continued to use any spare time he had to study music. Working around the clock, Dorsey had been swallowed up by the blues, both literally and figuratively. He had reached a point in his life when he could not produce the lyrics of music he had so easily created in the past. In fact, he could do nothing at all. He could not practice, compose, or perform. The doctors called it a nervous breakdown. Dorsey called it a God interruption. His mother traveled to Chicago to nurse him back to health. During this time, his mother advised him to select the divine music over the devil's. However, once he recuperated, he returned to the music that paid, the music of jazz and blues. The conflict between Dorsey's secular and spiritual strivings would not rest, causing him so much anguish and despair that he could no longer perform his duties in either realm. During this second God interruption, he was in so much despair that he even considered suicide. As a remedy, his sister-in-law invited him to her church, and the pastor there told him, "Dorsey, the Lord has too much work for you to do to let you die." Then the pastor laid hands on him, prayed fervently and spiritually speaking, and pulled a serpent from Dorsey's throat. This supernatural experience, coupled with the death of a close friend, inspired Dorsey to write his first gospel blues song, entitled, "If You See My Savior, Tell Him You Saw Me." Dorsey was finally on his way to recovery. From 1928 to 1931, Dorsey tried to sell his gospel music to local churches only to discover they would not embrace the sacred music he infused with blues and jazz syncopations. The African American Church, which had successfully incorporated European sacred classics into its Sunday morning worship services, refused to consider incorporating Dorsey's music into its service. His music did not reflect the class and culture preachers were trying to promote in their conservative services. Reluctantly, he returned to what he knew best, composing secular music. Though immersed in composing the secular, Dorsey still had one foot in the gospel world and continued to compose gospel songs. In 1932, while in Indianapolis organizing a choir, Dorsey received tragic news. His wife and son died in childbirth. Thomas turned to the one source of comfort he knew, the piano. A mystical experience occurred. As his hands hovered over the keys, a strange sensation took over him, and he began to play a melody, and the accompanying words followed. For this experience, he composed a song, "Precious Lord, Take My Hand," his most famous gospel classic, sung in churches across America. Dorsey always maintained that this song came from God himself. Dorsey knew that when he heard a minister named Reverend W.M. Nix emotionally singing at a conference in 1921, he wanted to be just like him. Though initially he attempted to live in both worlds, in 1930, he finally heeded his mother's advice and immersed himself in the gospel tradition. He attained a position at Pilgrim Baptist Church in Chicago, where he organized one of the first gospel choirs. He also founded the first gospel publishing house by African American composers. By organizing the first national convention of gospel choirs and choruses in 1932, he nationalized the gospel music tradition. By obeying the voice of God and utilizing his gifts, Thomas A. Dorsey revolutionized sacred church music and ushered in a new genre, gospel.
Special thanks to Inspirational Christians for use of their written biographies. Please visit inspirationalchristians.org for more biographies and articles.